So today is United Nations Day, marking the official creation of the United Nations on the 24th of October back in 1945. As the war in Gaza rages on, let's talk about the role of the world body in periods of global turmoil, including conflict. For this, we're joined tonight by Professor Adekeye Adebajo from the University of Pretoria Centre for the Advancement of Scholarship. A very good evening to you, Professor. Good to have your time. It's a bit difficult, isn't it, to be optimistic and have faith in the role and the place of the United Nations in the global context when you look at the many perils in the world, not least of which the bloodshed in Israel and in Gaza.
Yes, it's a real tragedy to see what is going on with the United Nations celebrating its 78th anniversary today, and UN peacekeeping actually turned 75 today. It's important, though, to note on a historical note that the United Nations created Israel as a result of the Holocaust that had happened to 6 million Jews in Europe, of course. But then this was meant to be a territory that was shared between two states, and the UN had enshrined that in its treaties by 1967. I should also note that the very first United Nations peacekeeping mission happened in 1948 and was basically meant to observe and supervise the ceasefire between all of Israel's borders to try to secure Israel's borders. So the UN definitely had a very important role, and between 1948 to 78, half of the UN's peacekeeping missions were actually deployed in the UN, in Sinai, in Lebanon, on the Golan Heights between Israel and Syria.
Given then the involvement of the United Nations in the creation, as you were saying, of the State of Israel, is it playing a sufficient role now in addressing, in particular, the root cause of much of the bloodshed, which are issues around the occupation and the long strife of the Palestinian people for statehood? Because that's now come back into the conversation. Even Joe Biden from the US saying, well, a state for Palestinian people needs to be created, even if the armed group Hamas is killed off.
I think it's important to understand how the United Nations works and who is the United Nations. So there's a humanitarian aspect of the United Nations, which is organizations like the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the UN Development Programme, UNICEF, which deals with children, etc. And they tend to do very important work in terms of humanitarian areas, and the UN has been doing important work in Gaza, in the West Bank, to try to bring relief to the Palestinian people. But then you have a more political angle of the United Nations, and you have a forum like the United Nations Security Council, which is the most powerful body in the UN, and the only one whose decisions are binding on all 193 United Nations members. And there are 5 powerful countries on that Security Council that sit on there permanently: US, China, Russia, France, and Britain. And these countries basically all have veto power. And what has happened in the past is that the United States, which is very close to Israel and gives Israel $3.8 billion, mostly in military aid, every year, has basically used its veto to protect Israel and to stop any serious sanctions or punitive measures being taken to even condemn some of Israel's aggression and, some of its worst excesses as well, even while recognizing that Hamas also has committed some atrocities. But I think that one will find that the occupation that's been going on for the last 50 years is one that has basically seen more atrocities, I would argue, on the part of Israel. But the US has protected its ally, along sometimes with Western allies like France and Britain as well. So you have to recognize when you're talking about why the UN hasn't done more, how the UN actually works.
And just on that point then, the Security Council, which is the most important, shall we say, body within the United Nations, as you were saying, decisions that are supposed to be binding, and we've seen these countries, which you referenced, with the veto power, all of them using that veto power to either protect themselves from scrutiny or protect their allies. Would the United Nations Security Council be more effective, more helpful, more useful to all of humanity if no country had veto power?
I think possibly yes, but we have to look at the history of how the veto power came about. You know, before the United Nations, there was the League of Nations, which existed between 1919 and 1945, and several powers, Japan, Italy, Germany, basically opposed the League of Nations, left the League of Nations, and basically started acting outside of it. So the lesson that was drawn by the founders of the United Nations in San Francisco in 1945 is that only through great power cooperation could the United Nations be effective. So they weren't naive when they gave themselves veto power. As far as they were concerned, it was the only way they would get all the great powers to join. And the success or failure of the United Nations was thus fated to be based on great power cooperation. And sometimes we've seen some of that cooperation, like after the Cold War in the 1990s, you saw an explosion of UN peacekeeping missions. You had about 50 missions between 1989 and 2010, and the previous 3 decades, you'd only had 13 peacekeeping missions. So when the great powers choose to cooperate, the UN can work effectively. But the basic bargain at the founding of the United Nations was that the stronger powers would have veto power in exchange for the weaker majority having more say over socio-economic development. So some of the agencies like the UN Development Programme and the Food and Agriculture Organization, the developing countries would have more say and also be able to have more say on the budget within the UN General Assembly. And that's how the UN has operated for 78 years.
And now, one of the complications of that system is that the veto power members, yes, they've not always been friends, but we've seen that worsen, especially in the last decade or so. For example, the long-standing issues between the Russians and the Americans, China versus the US, often spill over into other issues that come before the Council. Is there any way in which that can be addressed at this stage?
Well, one of the things that needs to happen is that the UN Security Council reflects the world of 1945. It's only ever reformed and expanded. That was in 1965 when it was expanded from 11 to 15 members. It hasn't been changed ever since. And there are powers like, for example, South Africa, Nigeria, Brazil, India, that should be represented, in my view, on the UN Security Council to make it a more legitimate and a more universal council. And the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has published a document, an agenda for peace, and has been working on reform processes towards a summit for the future, which is destined for next year, 2024. And he's trying to refine multilateralism in what he calls creating a new networked multilateralism. So I think the best we can hope for is reform so that it increases its legitimacy, it increases its representativeness, and hopefully it makes it more effective. But there are no guarantees. And if the great powers, such as you see with Russia and Ukraine, are not able to agree, then there will be no cooperation. But that's the way the system was set up. It wasn't some kind of naive setup or contraption.
Right. And Professor Adebajo, if I may run a line from you, a news line that's coming out of the debate that was happening at the UN Security Council just this evening, we're seeing here that the Israeli foreign minister now is cancelling meetings with the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres over Guterres' comments that the Hamas attack, quote, did not happen in a vacuum. And we're hearing that the Israeli foreign minister is in fact calling for the resignation of the UN Secretary General. What implications would that sort of thing have for the ability of the United Nations to do its job and do so independently of states?
Well, the UN Secretary General position is one that's been a very difficult position. And it's clear that the powerful members, especially the 5 veto-wielding members, have always said that they want more of a secretary than a general, and they don't want anyone that's going to make waves. But in the past, you've had secretaries general like the Swede, Dag Hammarskjöld, who was in that office between 1953 and 1961, who incurred the wrath of the Russians over what they saw as his pro-Western policies, and they wanted him to resign. He died in a plane crash in 1961 over Zambia. You had Boutros Boutros-Ghali from 1992 to 96, an Egyptian scholar diplomat who was a brilliant scholar and not always a very diplomatic Secretary General. And he incurred the wrath of the Americans, and they prevented him from having a second term, the first ever Secretary General that was denied a second term. So it's not unusual for member states to call for the resignation of the Secretary General or to try to block what the Secretary General is doing. I personally don't think, though, that Guterres is in his second 5-year term now, and he's a Portuguese Secretary General from a NATO member state, and I don't think he's been particularly pro-Palestinian. If anything, I think he was criticized for being slow to call for a ceasefire in this conflict. So I don't personally think that Guterres will be, asked to resign or be pushed out as a result of the Israeli foreign minister being upset with him. But Israel has always had a difficult relationship with the United Nations because the United Nations has always insisted that its resolutions from 1967 on a 2-state solution should be implemented.
Good to have your time. Thank you so much. Professor Adekeye Adebajo from the University of Pretoria's Center for the Advancement of Scholarship.